Hi, everyone. So I want to talk for a little bit about very early South Africa, the earliest inhabitants of this region of Africa. Of course, Africa was home to the earliest human development and specifically the rise of the Homo sapiens subspecies of the hominids, and that's, of course, our subspecies. And so the earliest fossils, in fact, that we have of Homo sapiens come from the Cape region in South Africa. There may be others, of course, but the earliest ones that have been uncovered by paleontologists are in this area. So Homo sapiens developed in Africa, and from very early on, they were living in South Africa, Southern Africa. And so this place has a very long history of human habitation and human activity. Um, However, there are lots of source problems um, that stand in the way of a full investigation of human activity very early on in Southern Africa. And these should be fairly obvious, right? There are no written documents. There really aren't any written documents until the arrival of Europeans, in fact, in the 17th century. This should not, however, deter us entirely from trying to understand what was happening in southern Africa for many millennia before Jan van Riebeeck and the Dutch East India Company arrived there. There is an interesting and complex history of human habitation in South Africa. That can be gleaned from a variety of sources. And if you've never taken an African history course from me before, you are perhaps at a disadvantage in not having been exposed to things like the use of linguistic evidence. And I don't want to take the time necessarily to go into that here. It only impinges on our, ultimately on our subject very little. But there are some very creative scholars out there who have used things like linguistic evidence and corroborated that with paleontology and to some extent with archaeology, finding as well things like artistic remains, cave paintings, and very early sculptures and things like this, to try to understand what human life was like long before we got in the habit of writing things down, right? And this opens up a vista of South Africa that is very interesting, that shows interaction between a variety of different, well, I don't want to say different types of human beings, but people who were engaged in very different activities. And from this, we can identify, and this is very, very rough here, and Thompson, I think, is the textbook is a good deal more nuanced, and so I would encourage you to read that closely. But three basic types of activities that human beings engaged in for many millennia in South Africa, certainly long before the arrival of the Europeans. The first of these, and the longest lived of these, is hunting and gathering. And the oldest people on Earth, at least genetically speaking, that is, we can trace the kind of DNA origins back to this people. So the oldest people, the kind of ultimate primeval people, are the San people of southern Africa. Um, there's a group called the Biaka in Central Africa who have similar very early DNA vestiges. Anyway, I don't want to go necessarily into the genetic science of this whole thing. But suffice it to say, we are, descended from these people in Africa, or that their ancestors were also our ancestors, and that these represent, the kind of closest strain of human development to the very earliest Homo sapiens. The hunter-gatherer groups in southern Africa spoke from very early on, from the earliest development of language, languages that were composed primarily of cliques. Okay, so there are some remaining cliques in the Bantu languages of southern Africa. You will hear me occasionally talk about the Xhosa people, for instance. There will be a number of individuals we encounter who have clicks in them, clicks in their names. But the Khoisan language has a lot of clicks, and there are nuanced clicks, and it's of course impossible for someone who does not know this language to be able to kind of hear the nuances of the different clicks. And if this were a classroom class, I might take time to teach you how to do a few different clicks, the three basic clicks that end up in the Bantu languages. But given that this is an online class, it doesn't really work. But anyway, that's linguistically, that's the language that they spoke. The economy of hunter-gatherers, I think, is very misunderstood. I mean, it's simple on the kind of surface of it, right? These people are involved in hunting wild animals and gathering sources of food that grow in the wild, things like roots and berries and edible grasses and seeds and things like this. Hunter-gatherers obviously develop a fantastic knowledge of these things. They know where to find food. They know which foods are edible and which will make you sick, which will kill you. They are adept at finding animal sources of food, right? And so that all I think is fairly obvious, and should, I think, lead to a good deal of admiration for these people who, were able to, for many, many millennia, for much longer than we have been doing other things like farming. People, in Africa and eventually other places were hunting and gathering and living a life based on that. What is often misunderstood is how kind of the quality of life of hunter-gatherers. I think we assume that if human beings are reliant on hunting and gathering, they must live a very poor existence. They must spend all of their time in a hard scrabble pursuit of food, and that this is just a terrible way to live. But there have been some studies of hunter-gatherers who have persisted into the modern day. One of these groups actually is the Khoisan. There were a number of Khoisan groups in what is now Botswana, who were still living the same kind of life they had lived probably 50,000 years ago or more, into the mid 20th century. I think most of them have probably been assimilated by this point. But there were some scholars at Harvard University, John and Elizabeth Marshall, and a few others who spent time with the San, documented their lives, got into their folklore, they learned their language, they made some documentary films about them. I would highly recommend these. Elizabeth Marshall wrote, sorry, not Elizabeth Marshall, Elizabeth Marshall Thomas is actually her name. John Marshall's her brother. Anyway, she wrote a book called The Harmless People, an ethnography of the San, and there's a really kind of close and nuanced look at the lives of these people. And what we find is that hunter-gatherers actually work only a few hours a week, an average of about 15 hours a week, and that they are able to have a good deal of leisure time to produce things like art and music, and to tell stories to each other. They have highly involved, I should say, forms of dance, religious rituals, and other things, and this is what they spend most of their time doing. Societally speaking, and so there's a robust culture. In fact, the Europeans who first went into southern Africa and began to kind of interact with these peoples and wrote accounts of them discovered that the hunter-gatherers were far more adept at things like artistic production than were the cattle raisers or the farmers. And this is because hunting and gathering does not demand nearly as much work, ultimately, as these other forms of activities do. Now, it may be said that this is probably a less stable existence. If there is a massive, drought or something like that, hunter-gatherers, their main sources of food almost certainly would dry up. The San are heavily reliant on a certain type of nut that grows in southern Africa, the mongongo nut. And if those plants are dried up and not growing, a major source of their calories is taken away. If there's a kind of disease outbreak among the wild animals, that can cause all sorts of problems, and they're of course competing with other predators. So there were times, almost certainly, when hunter-gatherers faced the very kind of edge of their existence, right? But this is true for pastoralists and for farmers as well. They lived primarily in family groups, not just a kind of nuclear family, but extended kinship groups. Their folklore, of course, is part of this. They told stories about their ancestors and had a kind of group identity out of the stories that they told. And so this, the society and culture interacted with each other. Now, the emergence of pastoralism, that is animal herding in southern Africa, is another thing that has been well misunderstood, I think. There was long an assumption, and we might as well talk about agriculture in connection with this. There was long an assumption, and this map that I have on the slides can go along with this misleading assumption, but I'm going to try to nuance it because I think it's actually valuable to think about this. Anyway, this long-held assumption that that pastoralists and agriculturalists arrived in southern Africa via a long-distance migration. And there were various timelines for that migration put forward, but that they came from probably the Great Lakes region up here, Lake Victoria, Lake Tanganyika, Lake Malawi. This is called the Great Lakes region. There are a number of other lakes there too. That they traveled long distances down here into the lands both west and east of the Drakensberg Escarpment, and that this process was not completed until, maybe the 17th or even 18th century, right? So that timeline is going to be important. I'll talk about why in just a minute here. The Europeans also assumed that this had happened in two major waves. That there was a wave of pastoralist migration, so animal herders coming from kind of East Central Africa down here into South Africa over a long distance, bringing with them their cattle, their sheep, their goats, and that they, pushed the Aboriginal hunter-gatherers, into the more marginal lands and occupied the better watered lands for their cattle, and that was followed later, even in the minds of many European scholars early on, fairly recently, by agriculturalists, the Bantu-speaking peoples, who came down here and sort of pushed the pastoralists out of the best farmland into the more dry lands here in the central part of southern Africa, and that this the hunter-gatherers, the San, which the Europeans pejoratively called the Bushmen, were then pushed into the Kalahari Desert, right? And so we have, and by this view, both the pastoralists, who were called the Hottentots by the Europeans, but the native term and the much better term, I think, is the Khoikhoi. That they came in one phase, and that the Bantu, whom the Europeans tended to call Kafirs, that is a slur, a racial slur. It makes me sick to even say it, having lived in South Africa. It's very similar to the N-word, okay, but this was the standard word that Europeans adopted for the Bantu farmers, and so all three of these kind of pejorative terms, the Bushmen, the Khoikhoi, and the Kafirs, were seen, as having made it where they were through this process of long distance migration. Well, scholars more recently have done a great deal of work on this and have begun to paint a very different picture. First of all, pastoralism was not something that came from a long distance. It's a much more complex process to bring pastoralism to southern Africa. And it's a mixed kind of accomplishment of Aboriginal peoples of southern Africa and migrants from other parts of Africa, though not necessarily long distance migration. There's a lot of evidence that pastoralism first emerged among the Aborigines in kind of the lands of northeastern Botswana, east of the Okavango Delta, and that these hunter-gatherers began to capture sheep and goats, and domesticated them and began to keep them and milk them and use their wool and things like that. The animal byproducts that are so important to pastoralists. This was coupled with the arrival of people from from East Africa as part of this much longer process of migration. But this was not, a one-shot migration from the Great Lakes down into southern Africa. This is something that happened piecemeal over a very, very long period of time. And the same goes with the arrival of the Bantus, right? And so the Khoikhoi are almost certainly the result of interaction between these migrant farmers, I should say mixed farmers, meaning they did both pastoralism and agriculture, and the Aboriginal inhabitants here, that this was not a process of conquest and then another conquest. This was actually a good deal more interaction between these people. The hunter-gatherers trading with the pastoralists, trading for milk and furs, trading their magongo nuts and the meat that they obtained via hunting and things like this for the animal byproducts of the pastoralists. Once the agriculturalists arrived, they also they initially showed up in fairly small numbers, and traded with the hunter-gatherers and with the Khoikhoi, and intermarried with them. And so these are not isolated communities. That's the kind of long and short of this. That there was a great deal of interaction between them. They traded with each other. Yes, they ultimately did come to violence, and the farmers took over the best watered lands, and as they expanded, it left the hunter-gatherers and the pastoralists in the more marginal lands. There was almost certainly tension between the hunter-gatherers and the pastoralists as well. But all three of these groups share common DNA. They intermarried with each other, and their presence as different economies came from a good deal more complex interaction than this old thesis this old thesis offered. Okay. The Bantu farmers brought with them, and let me clarify a couple of terms here. Swidden agriculture. This is the standard form of agriculture among the Bantus. This means that they arrive at a piece of land, and we have kind of migration over short distances, just a few miles at a time, perhaps, of each chiefdom or even each family. These migrant or colonizing farmers, as they're sometimes called, will move a little bit at a time as the land becomes less fertile, as it depletes its nutrients. Then they move to another piece of land. They might go back to the piece of land they farmed previously after a few years, after it's regained some of its nutrients. But this is the short-term farming of land until depletion of nutrients, and then the leaving of it fallow while another piece of land is worked in its place. That's Swidden agriculture, as it's called. And this is the standard type of agriculture in pre-modern Africa, all over the continent, at least all over sub-Saharan Africa. And that was how, farming arrived in southern Africa. The origins of farming can be traced back as early as the early centuries CE. Certainly by the 3rd century CE, we have solid evidence of Bantu farmers in the area of kind of northeastern South Africa, the area just south of the Limpopo River. And given that the highest levels of rainfall and the best farmland is here east of the Drakensberg Escarpment, farmers quickly made their way down into that area, into what is now KwaZulu-Natal. But they also took up residence on the plateau here, the Highvelds. And this is where the interaction between the pastoralists, the hunter-gatherers, and these mixed farmers took place at the highest level. They brought with them iron technology, and iron is tremendously important, really kind of almost a symbiosis. That's not really the right word, but there's an intimate relationship between the working of iron and agriculture in Africa, and where the use of iron tools is absolutely key for the clearing of land and this type of Swidden agriculture. The primary social form among the Bantus was the village, though this varied. They did have villages in many cases. This was true more among the people of the plateau than the people of east of the Drakensberg Escarpment, the kind of subtropical zone. There's another term that it's actually an Afrikaans term, but it was used to describe the Bantu. It's called the kraal. This is the individual homestead. And especially among the Ngoni peoples of the eastern part of South Africa here, the east of the Drakensberg, the individual homestead was the kind of, key social unit, right? That a small kinship group, an extended family would live in a kraal. There would be a kind of alpha male, a central male dominant figure there who would be akin to a kind of small level chief, but these individual kraals would then come together in larger social units for the purposes of warfare and religious rituals and things like this. This is again very piecemeal, slow kind of diffusion across southern Africa over the course of maybe a millennium and a half or so. Now, why is that timeline or that interpretation important? Well, when the Europeans began to make their way across southern Africa in the 18th and especially the 19th centuries, they came to the conclusion that the Bantu, who were the vast majority of all of the native peoples of southern Africa, by far the largest numbers were these mixed agriculturalists. They came to the conclusion that the Bantu had arrived around the same time that Europeans had, and that the Europeans had as great a claim, or maybe even a better claim, to the land than the Bantus did, right? Because they were, as they saw them, interlopers. They even, at times, these Europeans set themselves up as the protectors of the Khoikhoi, or of the hunter-gatherers, the San. This, of course, despite the fact that they were in the habit of enslaving these pastoralists and these hunter-gatherers, something we'll talk about shortly, right? This interpretation, which is historically inaccurate, this is faulty to the nth degree, continues to persist among some who insist on kind of white supremacy in southern Africa, at least in fairly recent times. As I was preparing for this class this semester, this term, I was looking up a documentary that I'm going to have you watch later in the term on YouTube, and I just scanned through some of the comments, and there were people who said, well, the Bantus don't have a right to this land. It's not theirs. They didn't work the land. They weren't using it. They were moving around. The Bantus were moving across southern Africa. They didn't settle there permanently, and so the whites were the ones who had the best claim to the land. And I cannot tell you how faulty that is, or how many problems there are with that. Hopefully you can see those. But this interpretation does matter for the history of South Africa. These various interpretations of how different peoples arrived in southern Africa have been part of the claims to the land, the claims to political supremacy, and other things that we'll talk about for much of the rest of the semester. Okay, we will halt there and talk a bit more about especially the Bantu peoples in the next lecture.